Hey, hello, how you doing? My name is Tehja Avani, and today is an extra special video. It is the continuation of my Vday Lovecore fashion project, and this episode is episode 3-ish. 3 of my Vday Lovecore fashion project, where I am sewing an underbust corset. I'm using the Arania Black's Nora, I believe, corset, underbust corset pattern, which is a great pattern. It's a great beginner pattern, and it's like really easy. It's easy to sew. You just have to nail it. You just got to practice sewing it. And this is what I was doing in this video. Yeah, I love the corset that I made. You'll see it at the end. It turned out great. It was just a couple little bumps in the road in making the corset, but it's okay because it still came out super duper pretty. So of course this is going to be a long video. For most of these like project kind of series vlog situations, it's going to be relatively long videos. So grab a drink, grab a snack, or grab whatever you want to grab in order to relax and enjoy the show. Also, all the materials will be linked in the description box and the pinned in the comments as well, so it's easy to see where all the materials is at. And also I'll have a Pinterest board linked down below as well, just in case anything's sold out, and I'll have like replacement materials in that Pinterest board as well. So anyway, lovelies, kick back, relax, and watch me sew this underbust corset. So anyway, let's get on to it. Alright y'all, so let's get started. I have this Nora underbust corset pattern from Arania Black. She used to have all these like free patterns, but I think she like deleted everything, so I'll find the pattern and link it down below. But what I did is I added 3/4 of an inch seam allowance on the side seams, and then 1/4 inch on the tops and the bottoms. And I believe it's an 8-panel corset in total. Like there's like 8 on one side and 8 on the other side, so I got 16-panel corset. That's the pattern I will be using. I think I use size either C or D for this corset. I'm not really sure because I'm like in between both of those sizes. So anyway, these are the 3 fabrics I'll be using in order to complete the corset. So for the structure layer, I'm using this 10-ounce duck canvas layer, which you've seen me use a million times already. Then I'm using this charmeuse crepe back satin, pink satin, and then on top of that, to strengthen it even more, I'm using this medium weight fusible interfacing in order to just add a little bit more structure and just to make sure the wrinkling of the fashion fabric layer is minimal. So what I'm doing now is that I'm just going to trace out all of my pattern pieces on each of the fabric pieces. Well, interfacing isn't fabric, but whatever. But I'm just going to trace them out and cut them out on the 3 different pieces of fabric. I don't have a lining because I was just a little lazy and I just want to get this corset done because I thought I was under the pressure of time. But y'all know me and time. We have a on and off relationship. So but I was still in the mindset of trying to get it done as soon as possible. So what I'm doing here is, I told you I'm tracing out all of the pattern pieces, and I'm marking all the notches and all that stuff, which is just like the waist notch to me is the most important for a corset. So I just marked that. And so once I do one side, I trace out all 8 pieces. I'm going to flip all the pieces over and then trace it again so that they're mirrored pieces. So you should have 16 pieces in total from each layer of fabric, and they like the double pieces should mirror each other, if that makes any sense. It's the same thing if you watch the Roxy bodysuit corset bodysuit videos that I've done, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm cutting all the pieces out and cutting the notches as well, just so I know exactly where they are. And again, like I said, I do that for each fabric that I have. That's what it looks like when I cut out the second set of 8 pieces. So like I said, just to mirror everything. So anyway, I cut out everything because I won't bore you with that. It was already 4 minutes into this video. So I have everything together. And so now it's time to actually make a corset and pin all the pieces together. Oh, before we do that, actually, I am going to align the fusible interface pieces with the satin pieces. And I'm going just to iron them down real quick just to get that out of the way, because that's just like tedious and like the most boring part of corset making in general. So I'm just lining up all the pieces here, and then I'll be ironing them like real quick, and then we'll move on to the actual sewing process. So then you see the difference between like the shape and the texture and the way that the fabric moves once the fusible interfacing is applied and ironed on. It just adds just a lot more structure to it, you know, especially to a very structural garment. So this is what it looks like. Once I do all that, I'm showing one side because all 16 pieces would just be too much. And I just placed the pattern pieces on top. I don't know why. I think just to show that for some reason they ended up oversized pieces anyway, but I just went ahead and continued to sew anyway. So, you know, I'm the queen of winging it and still making it look good in the process. Okay. So now what I'm doing first is I'm evening out all the pieces because some fusible interfacing is peeping out from underneath the satin on some of the pieces. So I'm just cutting off the excess fusible interfacing to make it all clean. So I did that for both sides, and then now I am pinning them all together. So I'm starting with the front piece. You place one piece on top of the other piece, right sides together, and you pin at the waist. I did it from the top going down for some reason for this. That's not a good idea. You should always pin at the waist first and then continue to pin up and down the piece, because the waist and the placement of the waist is the most important part. So then you repeat. So then you kind of like flip that piece open, put the next piece on top of it, right sides together, align them at the waist, pin it, and then continue to pin up and down. And you do that for all 16 pieces. So again, I'm just showing y'all a little bit real quick, and then I think I move on to like the sewing process. It's a lot of prep that goes into corset making. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of like, it's not like a complicated thing to make as in like extreme techniques and like super high couture or super advanced techniques. It's just a lot of tediousness, and you really have to take your time and like perfect your method. That's just really more the situation than it being like super hard to sew. All right, so this is what it looks like once I pinned all 8 pieces together for one side. And so I'm going to do the same thing for the other satin side piece thingy. And then the same thing for the canvas layers as well. And this is what it looks like once everything is pinned. And what I do now is that I sew at 3/4 of an inch on every single seam that I have pinned together, and take like literally an hour of sewing because it's a whole bunch of seams to do. But I'm just going to take that to the sewing machine, do that real quick. Make sure that you back tack at the beginning and the end of your seams as well, just to really ensure the strength of the seams. And as you see a little bit that my hair is making a guest appearance, I'm so sorry. As you know, if you've been here before, my hair always gets in frame because I like to keep it in braids. And sometimes it's just like gets in the way because I underestimate how long it is. Because so like just keep in mind that it's not going to be a lot, but you're going to see her a couple of times. Okay. But anyway, as you see, I transitioned from the canvas layer to the satin layer and just sewing all the seams. I also put a piece of tape where the 3/4 of an inch sewing mark is as well, just to make it easier to keep the seams as accurate to the size as possible. So this is what it looks like once I sewed everything. It looks the exact same as when I pinned it. And so what I'm just going to do real quick is just cut off all the threads that I don't need. And then I'm going to cut my seam allowance in half, but also make sure that you cut the notches, the waist notches as well, because usually when I cut off half of the seam allowance, I cut off the waist notch marks. And so here what I'm doing is just making that cut of the waist notch a little bit deeper so that even when I cut the seam allowance in half, it still be there. And so now what I'm showing you is that I am going to press the seams open on the satin layer. Now, this is my second time doing the voiceover, so I was very confused as to why I did it. And so now it makes sense because it's been a while since I sewed this corset. So I thought I was going to use the seam allowance. That's why it's so big. I thought I was going to use the seam allowance for boning channels, but I decided to change my mind. So I end up doing, what I end up doing is cutting one side of the seam, because you know there's two pieces of fabric, one side of the seam down shorter than the other side of the seam, and I'm going to press it towards the back of the side seam, if that makes any sense. On the canvas layer, you kind of saw what I was talking about, but it's still a little hard to explain. So after that, I also try to iron the pieces as best as possible, but dear Lord, it's hard to iron. But after that, I'm going to align the canvas and satin layers right sides together and pin at the center front for both sides. And so now what I'm doing is marking the seam allowance, which is 3/4 of an inch, just so that I know where to place the corset bust, because we're going to insert the corset bust now. So I'm just marking that with the pencil first, just to make it a little more accurate and easier for me, because eyeing everything, it just gets tiring at a certain point. And also, if you're like a beginner, it's hard to like eye like everything. But this is the corset bust. I'm using a steel, I believe 10-inch corset bust for this underbust corset. Yeah, and I'm doing the same thing to the other side real quick. All right, so I'm going to take the loops of the corset bust, and what I'm going to do is align it on that seam line, and just make sure that when you align it that you kind of start the corset bust like 1/4 of an inch down from the top, because that's where the seam allowance is for the tops of the corset for me. And I'm going to mark each side of the loops from the outside, just so I know where to skip the stitches when I am stitching the center front down, because we need little holes so that you can slip the loops into. Oh, I did 3/8 of an inch down. Sorry. I did 3/8 of an inch just to leave a little ease and or a little bit of space, just to make sure that if I go over 1/4 inch that I don't hit the bust. So with every little gap, that's the place that I'm not going to stitch, if that makes any sense. It's easier to see than to explain. So then on the other side, we're just going to sew it straight, because that's where the posts are going to be, and we'll be poking holes instead of like making gaps and stuff like that. So here I'm on the sewing machine, I'm showing y'all how I'm skipping everything, and I'm also back tacking after every skip as well, again just to reinforce the stitches as best as possible. So I'm going to cut the gaps of stitches as well, just to make sure that nothing is, you know, kind of like, I just want it to be as clean as possible. So as you see, I kind of started a little bit and just cut those excess threads because we don't need them. All right, so next what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that center front seam and press it open in order to make it easier to insert half of the bust into that center front seam. Then I'm going to take the loop side of the corset bust and just make sure that the front of the loops, which is the more bubble part, because there's a flat side, which is the one that you see, and then the front side is a little bit more rounded, making sure that that front side is facing the fashion fabric layer and the flat side is facing the canvas layer. And I'm just going to insert the loops in the middle of that center front seam, where all of the gaps are in the stitching. All right, so I flip the fashion fabric layer over, and that's what it looks like. And so that's kind of what it's giving right now. So that's kind of how you insert the corset bust. So what I'm going to do is just clip the center front and the bust together, just to make sure that it stays in place before I sew it down again. All right, so now that everything is clipped in place, I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and sew right next to that corset bust using a zipper foot, so I can get as close to the corset bust as possible, but still make sure that you don't sew over the bust, because you will break your needle. So, and also take your time sewing this part as well, just to make sure that the line is as straight as possible, because I do need practice in that department. All right, so that's what it looks like for the loop side. So now I'm going to tend to the other side of the corset where the posts are supposed to go. All right, so now you see I'm going to cut the seam allowance in half on, and marking the waist notch on the center front seam. And then what I'm going to do now is flip the layers over so that the wrong sides are touching in the corset. And then I'm going to clip them in place, or clip the center front in place and iron it down just to make sure that it's flat and as, you know, accurate as possible. So what I'm going to do is take the other side of the corset, align the loops against the other side of the center front, and pretty much mark where the posts are supposed to go. If that makes any sense. I know I talk a lot and so sometimes it doesn't make any sense, but y'all can see what's on the screen. Okay. So now that I've marked that with the pencil, I'm going to take my awl, which is like used mostly for leather working. But corset makers also use it too. And I'm just going to punch holes where I marked where the post should go. And I'm marking holes instead of punching holes, only because you don't want to mess up the integrity of the fabric, and also you don't want to punch a hole way too big. So poking the holes is just a better option. So now I'm going to take the post side of the corset bust and pretty much insert the posts into the holes that I just poked. And you kind of have to finagle. It's a little tight. You kind of have to finagle the fabric around the post. It's just a tight squeeze and it takes a while. So I'm mostly not in frame for this because I don't you know, because like I need to be like up close in order to get that done. You might have to use the awl to like, or your nails to like kind of move some fibers of fabric from the fabric like over in order to make sure that the post is completely through the hole, if that makes any sense. But this one, it's kind of one of the most frustrating parts of sewing a corset is the inserting the post side of the corset bust. So anyway, I'm just going to take my time doing that, and then I'll do the same thing, which is to sew the bust in place with the zipper foot. All right, so this is what it looks like once all that is set in, and so we officially put in the corset bust for this underbust corset. So now it's time to add all of like the structure to it and just finish up the underbust corset. So the first things first that we have to do, or I have to do, I keep saying I have to do, is insert the waist tape, which is relatively easy. You just align the cotton twill tape. I'm using 1.25 inches because that's just the one I have. Along the waist notches of the corset. And the thing that you gotta make sure is that you have a little bit of tension with it, just not too much that it distorts the shape of the corset, but just a little bit, just to make sure that's a little tight, in order for it to be just as accurate as possible. You don't want it to be like loopy and baggy or anything like that. So I'm just gonna pin all along each waist notch until I reach the end of the corset. And I'm going to do that for both sides. So I'm going to pin first, and then I'm going to baste it in place just to make sure that it just stays put. And the waist tape also gets basted in place because I'm going to use sewing the the boning channels in order to make sure that the waist tape gets sewn on as well. And so instead of sewing it individually, it'll just be with the boning channels. All right, so now that's done. I did it to both sides. Yeah, I'm just showing y'all real quick. What do I do next? I don't even remember. Oh, what I do is that I flip the pieces right sides together, the fashion fabric and the canvas layer, and align the center back seams together, and I sew at 3/4 inch as well. All right, once that's done, I'm going to flip the pieces inside out so that the right sides are showing. And then I believe at this point I align the seams of the canvas layer and the satin layer. Oh, first I'm clipping the center back together, and I'm going to iron that down. But after that, I align the satin seams and the canvas seams together just to make it as accurate as possible and that all the seams are in the right place. All right, so now you see me aligning the seams right here. I'm also making sure that the seam allowance of the satin and the seam allowance of the canvas are facing or going in opposite directions as well, so it's not too bulky on one side. And so as you see here, I align the seams and I'm going to pin them together, and I'm going to do that for both the top and the bottom. And soon you will see where I kind of messed up. Yeah, right there you can kind of see I have more of an excess on the satin layer than the canvas layer, so that ended up causing like bubbling and excess fabric, which pissed me off. I don't know how that happened, but it happened. So that's something that I have to improve on in the future, but I solved the issue for the project. But yeah, that pissed me off real bad because I didn't have that problem with my previous corset. So anyway, after I do all of that, I'm going to top stitch all of the seams, just to add a little bit of strength and structure to the corset, just to really fortify it against all of the tension that will be used when you put the corset on. All right, so this is what it looks like, and you can see how much more form and shape the corset has now that the top stitching is in. Like, it really affected like the structure of it and the strength of it a lot. And it's just really interesting to see, because even I watched the Bernadette Banner tutorial that she was making a corset for herself, and she was even talking about how like the shape of a corset really adds to the majority of the shape. Like literally, like it's not really the boning part of it like you would automatically assume. It's literally the shape of the corset, and that the boning doesn't only add structure, but it's all the stitching as well. So anyway, moving on, I am going to be sewing the boning channels. If you want to flip it to the canvas layer, or if you have lining, you can flip it to the lining layer and draw it in with some like heat markers. I forgot what you call them, but it's like the tailor's pens that if you iron it, it like goes away. You can use one of those to mark all of your boning channels and have it be like a temporary mark. So anyway, I'm going to sew all the boning channels in. I do 1/4 inch stitch right at the center back, just to fit the grommets and stuff like that. I think I did 2. Yeah, so I did, or at least, I know I did at least 1, just to have like a panel or like a landing strip for all the grommets. And then I sew about 1/4 inch next to all of the bony channels on the back side of it. So pretty much on the left side or the right side, depending on what side you're working on, if that makes any sense. But anyway, it's the side towards the center back. So as you see, as I sewed all the boning channels and now that's it finished, you can see even more structure was added to the corset, which is so interesting to me. And it's really coming together. And here I'm showing off the little excess fabric that I got. So like, just don't mind that, just ignore it, just act like it don't exist, okay? Act like it just doesn't, it's not even there, and that this corset is absolutely perfect. So anyway, I'm going to be bias binding the top and the bottom of the corset, but first I'm doing the top, and I cut out 4 strips of fabric. I believe they were like 2 inches wide. They should have been cut on the bias. I did not cut it on the bias because I was a little bit lazy, and I didn't have a specific length either. I just cut it as long as I could, but it should be at least the length of your corset with like 1 inch extra of space. So anyway, like I said, I'm going to bias bind the top first. So first, what I'm doing before I do any of that is just cutting off all the fraying that has been going on, because you don't want that all stuck in the binding itself. It's not needed, you know, just giving the corset a little bit of a trim before we move forward. So now that that's finished, what I'm going to do is take one strip of satin fabric. It's the same satin fabric too. And I'm going to align it across the top of the corset. Now, as you see here, I'm aligning it straight with the center front. That's wrong. You need about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch excess from on the center front and the center back of the binding, just so that you have something to fold around and kind of finish off all the raw edges. So I did that wrong, but at the back end, as you see towards the center back, I have a lot of excess strip to do. So I end up repinning it. But what I'm doing is just pinning across the top and making sure that the bias binding and the corset are touching with the right sides are touching. And now I'm basting the binding in place just to make it easier to sew, so I don't have to like remove pins as I'm sewing and all that stuff. So anyway, but I did have to redo all of this. I had to redo all of this because I realized I did it wrong after the fact. So I'm sewing at 1/4 inch. I don't think I said that before, but yeah, I'm sewing at 1/4 inch on the sewing machine, and it's a little challenging because it's just a little wavy. And so now that's what it looks like. So I'm just going to, first I'm showing you how the bias binding will work. But I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and just iron it. First, iron the seam of the bias binding. And then I'm going to fold the bias binding, double fold it around so that the raw edge is also tucked into the binding, and then I'll iron that down as well so that it keeps its shape. So as you see here, boom. So I'm first ironing the seam and pretty much ironing the binding upwards as best as possible. And then I'm cutting off the excess, like the excess that I don't even need. And I'm also cutting down the binding a little bit because it was a little too much. So maybe even like 1 inch or 1.5 inches would have been fine, or 1.25 inches. And then now I'm double folding the bias binding and pinning it in place. And then once I do all of that, I think I switched to clips eventually because it just is a lot easier because I don't have to go through all those layers. So after I clip the bias binding in place, then I iron it just so that it stays that way. All right, so that's what it looks like once I'm finished pinning. I know I iron it down, but then I sew pretty much at 1/4 inch going like from the top down, or you can say that it's top stitching the bias binding in place, one of the two, but I just stitch it down so that it looks relatively decent. As you can see here, it looks pretty good. I actually love it a lot. I love it a lot. And so now what I'm doing with the excess fabric from the bias binding is that I'm double folding it inwards into the corset and just hand stitching it in place and making sure that the hand stitches don't show on the outside. So I'm like stitching it to the bias binding and to the canvas layer, or if you have a lining, the lining layer. So just like that, it should look something like that. I'm holding it in place, but I do stitch it in place as well. As you can see, because I'm like literally barely in frame and it's not in focus either. But that's what it looks like once you do it. So after that, I put in all of the boning for the corset. And that is another thing. I love doing it. It just takes forever to do. But I just kind of cut the boning. I measure it out to the boning channel that I have, and then cut it 1/2 inch short, and then cut off and like round the edges of the plastic boning, and then I insert it, slip it in to the boning channel, and then rinse and repeat over and over and over again. And so what I like to do is, like, when I haven't done this for this corset, but recently, since I make a ton of boned garments, is that I like to measure out the boning channel, especially if there's like 2 halves, measure out the boning with the boning channel, cut it 1/2 inch short, and then just measure out a second piece from that cut boning, plastic boning, and just so I have double, and just makes it easier than doing it like twice, like over and over and over again for both sides. It's just, yeah, it's too much. So it helps it make it faster and easier as well. All right, so I'm just finishing up that last bone, and this is what it looks like once all the bones are in. So I'm going to repeat first for the other side, and then repeat the same bias binding technique for the bottom of the corset, and also add in some grommets. I don't have a clip of me putting in the grommets, but also add in some grommets as well towards the center back for that 1/4 inch seam allowance that I sewed. And then the corset is done for like sewing it. So anyway, I'll leave y'all to it, and I'll see y'all later at the end of the video. All right, so this is what the corset looks like. I absolutely love it. It is my second corset that I've ever sewn so far, and it looks pretty freaking good. Like, I love the shape of it. Just the only problem, well, there's two problems. Number one was the excess fabric for that panel, and number two was for some reason my busks are always crooked. This is the second time I've sewn a corset, and the second time that my busk is freaking crooked, and it's so annoying. It pisses me off. But other than that, it looks really, really good, and I'm very happy about it, and I just can't wait to rhinestone the absolute crap out of it. I love this light pink. It's so freaking pretty, and this is the same corset pattern and the way that I sewed the corset as the butterfly corset that I did for my birthday photo shoot situation. The one that I bedazzled the butterfly on. It's the same pattern and the same method I use. As I told you y'all before, all materials linked down below in the description box and the comments, and Pinterest board for any missing like sold out materials. And on top of that is Patreon. I got exclusive content, tutorials, DIYs, blogs, sewing patterns, and all of that good stuff and behind the scenes content. So if you're interested in signing up for my Patreon, it'll be linked down below in the description box. So that's pretty much it. It's an underbust corset. What else is new? I mean, we did it. We went through with it. Also, if you notice that I use red ribbon lacing as well, just to follow that Valentine's Day theme as well. So it just all kind of comes together. So anyway, yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's pretty much it for this video. So y'all, I will see y'all in the next video where I'll be bedazzling the crap out of this underbust corset. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe and turn on your post notifications so you'll get notified whenever I do post that video. So anyway, lovelies, that's it. As always, please love yourself, and I will see you next video. Mwah!